Overemphasis on test scores overlooks communicative ability, which is actually what success in language learning really looks like. Now, IELTS, and even to some extent school grades, are often viewed as the best indicator of language proficiency, but this perspective presents some really significant problems. Now, we all know that IELTS is an absolutely massive industry, and to some extent it has poisoned the efforts of many well-meaning parents trying to do the best for their young learners and give them the best start in life. In my 17 years of experience of teaching English in schools, I have noticed a trend, which is this. Parents tend to be highly involved with their child's English learning around grade 6 and to some extent by grade 7. Their involvement and interest sort of diminishes a lot. By grade 8 and then 9 and grade 10, these parents have disengaged entirely from the process of being involved with their teenagers' experience of learning English. And we just, as school teachers, we just never see those parents again after grade 6 unless there's a really significant problem. So even when we as teachers request to see parents during parent-teacher meetings, quite often the parents would just never show up. But when they did, there was always a sense that they just assumed that everything is going fine because I guess they're looking at test scores and they feel like that's an indicator that the child is developing in language. This assumption leads to the view that foundational English skills learned at school can simply be polished off in later teenage years by switching focus to what is called studying IELTS, rather than developing their English further as a language. And that distinction is very important. So for me, it's always been incredibly strange as a teacher when I hear other teachers say, I'm teaching IELTS. Or sometimes I'll see a job advertisement saying, can you teach IELTS? Now, that use of language is very deliberate, and it's really important that we take a moment to see what they're saying when they use that specific language, because very deliberately, they are not talking about the methodology and pedagogy that leads to developing the English skills. They are outside of that now. What they're talking about is something completely separate from actually helping the child or young learner grow in English. They're talking about gaming the system. They're talking about teaching people how to pass tests. And it's a very lucrative loophole for teachers to jump into as a niche, but it completely separates them from the world of developing those young learners and giving them what they actually need to thrive in life. So IELTS is not about developing a learner's language ability. It's about training for a very specific test format. And that format does not in any way prepare them for the real world that they're going to encounter after IELTS. So IELTS itself has been harshly criticized by researchers, and there's far too many points to mention here. But one of them of interest is that it just doesn't include real world tasks. The tasks were criticized as being very artificial and disconnected from authentic communication. And the process of IELTS doesn't really align very well with most of the processes involved in mastering English as a language. It's all about quick fixes to perform in a test. Explicit knowledge. So just to return to the school context, as mentioned before, between grades 7 and 10, many parents leave their child's progress in English entirely in the hands of the school. And the problem tends to lie with grades, which are often taken as indicators of progress, but in actual fact, don't really reflect language proficiency very well at all. So the grading system itself privileges written tests and explicit knowledge, in other words, facts and rules about language, over implicit knowledge, which is the deeper understanding of how the linguistic system works, how the language is acquired, which is the foundation of true language proficiency, which tends not to be reflected at all in the grading system. So learners are trained to perform very well in tests at school, and they're told exactly what type of information to include in assessed coursework to get full points. And this sort of grade-focused approach is what tends to erode learner autonomy and fails to build authentic language proficiency and skills because they're just too hard to assess, and the teachers are far too busy to incorporate that into a tight curriculum. As children reach puberty, typically during early adolescence, they often hit a learning plateau in studying English. The pace of learning slows dramatically and their motivation tends to wane too. Now, this is something I've observed in every school that I've worked in. By the time learners reach this stage, their mastery tends to decline and they spend about 3 to 4 years stagnating. And this is very common for most students, except those that are naturally gifted in languages or just super high performers at school. So eventually, parents become aware that there's long-term goals getting closer, such as international education and studying abroad. And that's when IELTS suddenly becomes the priority. But by this point, it tends to be too late. Those critical years of development have been missed. We're switching from authentic language learning to a sort of artificial test prep thing, and that cannot raise proficiency by itself. At this stage, the approach shifts to top-down instruction, where learners are shown the level that they need to reach, and they are trained to simulate performance at that level. IELTS specialists focus on that type of instruction, which is why the industry is so profitable, because the failure rates are so high and students have to retake the test multiple times only to make marginal gains. Now, this approach obviously creates an uphill climb of faking progress rather than developing genuine and lasting language skills and proficiency. The proper approach to language learning should be actually bottom up, meaning that identifying where the learner actually is and building up their skills from there to the next sort of level up. Language learning does need to be rooted in foundational skills and mastery, and ensuring that learners can progress confidently and independently. IELTS should be seen as the icing on top of the cake, but not the cake itself, right? So the real work lies in baking the cake by building a strong foundation of proficiency. So I believe that parents, teachers, and learners should all be working together towards common goals and communicating the same message, which is to ensure that learners are engaged in authentic learning that respects their current proficiency, rather than forcing them to operate way beyond their capabilities. Forcing learners to try to exceed their proficiency level too quickly can be deeply damaging, both academically and psychologically. It creates the illusion of progress while completely neglecting the sustainable learning processes that are supported by research. So the shortcuts involved in teaching IELTS produce only a facade of learning. Learners might well perform well on a given day, on a given test, but what happens after that? Many students will be ill prepared for the challenges that they will face in the real world. IELTS doesn't prepare them for that. They will lack the skills they need to communicate effectively or process high-level language in real time and navigate the demands of being functional in international education. This kind of thing contributes to high failure rates in international education and high rates of students that are unable to succeed abroad because linguistically they're very weak, and they were kind of deceived into believing that IELTS was the way to prepare them to succeed abroad, which it just clearly isn't. These experiences can be devastating for young learners and their families. This obsession with IELTS as a primary vehicle for success is one of the root causes. So while IELTS is a gatekeeping exam, it should be approached strategically with long-term planning, rather than viewing IELTS as a problem that needs to be solved quickly. We need to have consistent long-term efforts to build the foundational skills necessary for success. This means focusing on developing reading literacy to help learners acquire language more naturally in context, and adding new language to their internal linguistic system. It involves developing communicative competence, which requires strategies that go way beyond language itself. These strategies build the broader skill of communication, and they take years of consistent effort to develop, and they cannot be rushed